then we'll come back to jobs in a minute in terms of how we can sort of address some of that as a challenge. But the final theme, just in terms of what that future might look like, I just wanted to touch on briefly, is around ethics. I think consumers, us all as customers, will demand more from the businesses that they buy from in terms of understanding or putting trust in the sort of the ethics that sit behind products that people buy. And actually, the industry is in a real privileged position from the point of view of touching pretty much every community up and down the country to be able to deliver on that in terms of their customers. And actually, we're seeing more and more businesses do more in this space. And I think you've got an initiative connected to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is sort of your framework to be able to showcase what it is that you do as a group. And so the combination of all these changes, I think, are great news for customers, for consumers. That they're going to have an even better experience than they already get from the world of retail, and better service. We're going to see new brands actually emerge, and in fact, entrepreneurs coming into the industry perhaps that we haven't seen before. And so that actually, despite the fact that we started by painting a pretty sort of negative picture of where we are precisely at the moment, I see as something that is a part of a restructuring, a transformation process. And so it isn't about Armageddon retail, which is basically what the media story that they would like to write. This is about reinvention retail. And if you think about what comes out through many businesses going through that restructuring and transformation, that is a much more positive place to get to at the end of the day than perhaps what it looks like at the moment. And I think we as an industry, people in the industry, have got to stay focused on that future and not be sort of too drawn into the oh my god sort of bit of the present. As Joanne mentioned, I'm the chief executive of the BRC. BRC stands for the British Retail Consortium. We are a trade organisation, so it's a voluntary membership that you are paying, so we've got to make sure that we're giving you some value for money from that membership, otherwise we know that you won't necessarily renew. But our job really is to think about and try and influence the economic and the policy landscape in order to facilitate and enable that transformation to be undertaken successfully. And what that means in practice is a lot of sharing of best practices across businesses so that they can see what others are doing, but also in talking to government about things that are just basically a bit rubbish. A bit like Brexit, which is the next, it's kind of like, so picking on a couple of things that are the sorts of things that come up in the conversations that I have with lots of chief executives, and we end up talking to people in government. The high street is not dead, much as the media would like to suggest that. I think that there are those real destination locations that will continue to thrive, and there will be some that do find it more difficult in the future, particularly at the more sort of economically deprived end of the high streets up and down the country. But as a sort of general theme, those high streets or our high streets will be perhaps much less reliant on retail as the sort of core of what it is that they do. And I'm not saying as well as thinking about things like, we're having a housing shortage in this country, we need more housing, so how can we bring the community much more into there will be fewer retail jobs, but the nature of the jobs that are in the industry, I think, will continue to evolve and perhaps be really different. This is something that we, as Joanne mentioned earlier, some of the work that we're doing with you and other businesses, in the sense of, if you think of an industry that is evolving to be sort of much more digitally connected, the nature, I'm sure, of many of your roles have been changing over the last few years, and that will continue to occur as we look forward. And there's a real sort of challenge there about how you support and enable that change to happen effectively. And actually, there is a real opportunity there from the point of view of the nature of jobs. In fact, I think we've worked out there's about 100,000 people who work out of those 3.1 million within retail who are doing jobs today that didn't even exist just 5 years ago. And then we'll come back to jobs in a minute in terms of how we can sort of address some of that as a challenge. But the final theme, just in terms of what that future might look like, I just wanted to touch on briefly, is around ethics. I think consumers, us all as customers, will demand more from the businesses that they buy from in terms of understanding or putting trust in the sort of the ethics that sit behind products that people buy. And actually, the industry is in a real privileged position from the point of view of touching pretty much every community up and down the country to be able to deliver on that in terms of their customers. And actually, we're seeing more and more businesses do more in this space. And I think you've got an initiative connected to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is sort of your framework to be able to showcase what it is that you do as a group. And so the combination of all these changes, I think, are great news for customers, for consumers. That they're going to have an even better experience than they already get from the world of retail, and better service. We're going to see new brands actually emerge, and in fact, entrepreneurs coming into the industry perhaps that we haven't seen before. And so that actually, despite the fact that we started by painting a pretty sort of negative picture of where we are precisely at the moment, I see as something that is part of a restructuring, a transformation process. And so it isn't about Armageddon retail, which is basically what the media story that they would like to write. This is about reinvention retail. And if you think about what comes out through many businesses going through that restructuring and transformation, that is a much more positive place to get to at the end of the day than perhaps what it looks like at the moment. And I think we as an industry, people in the industry, have got to stay focused on that future and not be sort of too drawn into the oh my god sort of bit of the present. As Joanne mentioned, I'm the Chief Executive of the BRC. BRC stands for the British Retail Consortium. We are a trade organisation, so it's a voluntary membership that you are paying, so we've got to make sure that we're giving you some value for money from that membership, otherwise we know that you won't necessarily renew. But our job really is to think about and try and influence the economic and the policy landscape in order to facilitate and enable that transformation to be undertaken successfully. And what that means in practice is a lot of sharing of best practices across businesses so that they can see what others are doing, but also in talking to government about things that are just basically a bit rubbish. A bit like Brexit, which is the next, it's kind of like, so picking on a couple of things that are the sorts of things that come up in the conversations that I have with lots of chief executives, and we end up talking to people in government, people like the lovely Michael Gove and Boris Johnson and stories later. Anyway, I mean, but the sorts of things that we try to do is really help them understand the kind of the practical consequences of some of the lunar. Actually, better be careful because it's a bit go viral. Chief Executive BRC says this. Helping them understand some of the practical consequences of some of the things that they're thinking about. And so from a point of view of Brexit, there's three things from a retail industry that are really, really important. Firstly, there are nearly 200,000 people from the EU who work in retail that need sort of certainty that they can stay in the jobs that they've got, providing the value that they are to the businesses that they're working in today, and making sure that we have an immigration system that's fit for purpose in the future. Secondly, just about customs and processes, which has been a big sort of topical thing at the moment with this whole debate about whether or not we should or shouldn't be in the customs union. But from the point of view of practical retailers, it's like all we need to know is that we can move goods across borders easily. Let's just keep it that simple. And you have to just keep telling them things that are like really, really simple lots of times. And then you hope that they actually start listening to sense. But anyway, and then the third thing is sort of connected to customs is about tariffs, because that basically says if you have to start putting tariffs on top of the price of what you import, then obviously that's going to make things more expensive for customers. Like pretty basic, but politicians need it narrowed down to words of one syllable. So we talk a lot about Brexit. We also talk a lot about taxation. For anybody who's got physical shops, which you've got quite a few, business rates is a pretty topical subject. And we have a sort of business rate system that was kind of invented in a different, what does it say here, 20th century approach to a 21st century problem. And lots of the work that we've already done has saved some money for lots of retail businesses, but that's this much, and we've still got a gigantic tax that fundamentally needs to change. And actually, by changing it, would help that process of reinvention of our high streets and town centres that I talked about. And I said I'd come back to jobs, actually. So the sort of connecting what's happening in the industry to the work that the BRC is doing. I said earlier that there would be fewer jobs. The thing that we've been working with the HR community across our membership on is an initiative called Better Jobs, which is really setting out a vision for how to enable that transformation to occur most successfully and give even more opportunities for progression and for careers opportunities for people to work in the industry. And actually, this is one of the areas where I think the industry is making really great progress, whether it's on thinking about the challenges around things like digital skills, on diversity and inclusion, which is kind of quite relevant given I'm standing here today, as well as what drives engagement and staff satisfaction across with your colleagues. So what we are doing is helping you, our members, actually track progress from an industry point of view on how we're doing on your pay within industry, how that is rising faster than it is across the economy, on sort of efficiency, but most importantly on engagement with people who work in retail. And we've got a dashboard that's our sort of measure to see if we're making progress again with Better Jobs. And I also mentioned responsible business earlier, and that's another area where we, the BRC, have a role to play, because we can convene lots of retail businesses, and actually we've got an initiative also linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, which probably is quite connected to the sort of framework that you are working to, with a view to getting many retailers to kind of come together and, again, share best practice with a view of setting some commitments under various of the Sustainable Development Goals that are particularly relevant to retail, to try and drive momentum and drive change more quickly than would happen on its own. And I suppose that sort of brings nearly to the end of the sort of my retail and BRC connected bit of what I was going to talk about. And I think the sort of coming back to the people bit of that, I think is perhaps the most important one, because if you think about the sort of significance of the change that we're seeing, I think one of the most important differentiators is about having leadership through that change, and how people can be prepared and agile and adaptable through what is quite a significant transformation from an industry point of view. And that will be, I think, the main differentiator. And certainly, the women who work in the industry, as well as everybody else, obviously, will have a huge part to play in that. Right. Yes, that's like part one. Okay. So we're going to completely change subject now. So if anybody wants to, we can come back to questions on sort of the industry and the BRC's role in a minute. I'm now going to change subjects and go to, this is about me. This feels a bit sort of self-indulgent, but I'm going to talk a little bit about me for a minute. Which is, I haven't done that and that together, so it's all a bit sort of a brain, I'm going to have a brain freeze, whatever her name was in a minute. Okay, so I've been at the BRC for just over 5 years, and on the one hand it's quite funny because it's sort of, on the one hand it feels like it was sort of yesterday that I started, and on the other hand it feels like I've been in the job forever. I don't know if it feels like that for some of the jobs that some of you do. And I used to work for a company called KPMG, who some of you may have heard of. It's a financial services firm. It's actually an audit and accounting firm. It's one of the big four. I'm an accountant by background. Any other accountants? Okay, I can't share that with anybody. Okay, so they're the sort of numbers people sit in the corner, very quiet. So I used to work for KPMG, and I was there for like a long time. I started as a graduate, and I was there for 23 years. So the whole idea of like doing something in a different company was just beyond my thought process at all. And so I was working with retail businesses. I used to do audits and sign accounts of lots of retail businesses. And in fact, that's how I met your finance director, Richard Fleming, who was at one of my clients. I can't remember which company he worked for. I think he was at Sainsbury's then, actually. So I used to do audit work. I used to work with retailers. I was pretty much sort of probably stuck in a rut, basically, if you want to describe it as that. Been there for a long time. And then one day, somebody phoned me up. It was one of these headhunter people, and asked me if I wanted to do this job at the BRC, and I laughed. Like, really, I actually laughed. Anyway, I don't know whatever happens between laughing and actually sort of getting out of the office and speaking to some headhunter. So I ended up having this conversation with this headhunter. One thing leads to another. And then suddenly, after about 4 or 5 meetings, I'm finding myself in a room with a guy called Sir Ian Cheshire. Anybody heard of Ian Cheshire? So he used to be the CEO of Kingfisher. He's now the chairman of Debenhams, and he was at the time the chairman of the BRC. And so this was the sort of last stage of my interview process. So we're having this sort of chat, just me and him in the room, it was sort of obvious that it was interview, but it was kind of a two-way sort of conversation. Don't forget, I've never had a bloody interview before because I've been there for 23 years. Let's just remember that. And anyway, so having this nice chat, and then about halfway through the conversation, something sort of obviously clicked in his mind. He'd obviously made a decision in his head, because I can remember the moment in the conversation where it moved from sort of one thing to another thing, and then he spent the sort of second half an hour of this interview basically persuading me that I should do this job, and because I'd been sitting there right up until that point going, oh, I'm not sure, or I don't think I could do it, or not sure I want to leave, I've no idea, I've never been chief executive of a company, what does lobbying mean, how does government work, I don't know anything about politics. I mean, a real sort of, all the things like what not to do in an interview. Anyway, so there he was, so there he is. I mean, this is quite an important guy. He is a really impressive guy. And he's sitting there persuading me that I should take this job. And so I walked out of that room, and I don't know if this is sort of particularly aimed at some of the women in the room that have that little person on your shoulders that always got some thing that says, oh, that didn't go very well, that didn't go. I walked out of that room and I have never been so sure in my life. I went, oh my God, they're going to offer me the job. And I was like so sure that, that I was going to get this offer, which I have never been so confident about anything ever in my whole life. And I thought, what am I going to do now? Because I'm going to get this offer anyway, so I'm getting a bit boring now, but it's quite funny trying to remember. It's quite a long time ago. But so I had no idea what I was going to do, and actually over the course of they gave me like about 4 days to bloody decide what I was going to do. I have no idea. So first piece of advice I would give you, or give anybody in a similar sort of situation where you have no idea what to do, is go and talk to people that you actually trust, because not necessarily to say what the hell should I do, but just by talking to them actually helps you think through some of the sort of pros and cons that perhaps if you sit in a room on your own, you're just never going to get there. So I had loads of conversations with lots of people that I knew well, including my clients, that I thought would have, never wanted me to leave KPMG, and they were like, oh Helen, this is amazing, you should do it. And I'm like, you're supposed to be my client, how dare you be trying to persuade me to leave? But anyway, and then a great piece of advice that stuck in my mind when you've got one of those really difficult decisions sort of ahead of you. One of them was, what does your head say and what does your heart say? And I said, well, my head says, or I should say it, KPMG, it's like I'm a partner, that's like a very logical thing to do. I've got good jobs, that's what my head says. My heart says, oh, well, you never know. It's once in a lifetime, I can maybe do it. It just might work, It was like, right, okay, so that's follow your heart. And then the second piece of advice was, put yourself in 3 years' time and ask yourself, if you looked back, what would you think? What would you regret? And I mean, that was the killer one for me, because I knew that if I didn't say yes to doing something different then in my career, that would have been it. And I would probably, be at KPMG till I died, and if I stayed and then looked back in 3 years, I would have always gone, oh, what would have happened if? So, that was a kind of like big sort of step into the unknown, and just being a little bit sort of brave as to, even if you don't know how it's going to pan out, sometimes you've just got to go. So off I went, and then as soon as I decided, I mean, it was like this whole weight had sort of lifted off my shoulders. I got taller by about a foot overnight. It was pretty clever. And I've been there 5 years. I could tell you all the things that we've done, and that would be really boring. But we used to be old and stuffy and sort of boys clubby and a bit dull, and hopefully we're not that anymore. And so I won't talk anymore about the PLC. If anyone wants to know more, I can tell you. And so a couple of other bits of advice actually I've just noted down here. So just which are particularly relevant, I've sort of perhaps learnt since I've started. So one is, for what it's worth, obviously you don't have to follow my advice. This is I've taken the liberty of giving you some advice, but the first is you can't please everybody all the time. I run a trade association. I mean, this is your worst nightmare in terms of trying to please everybody all the time, right? You've got 100 retailers. You're trying to keep them all happy all the time. It's like no chance at all. So I'm sure the same applies to anybody in any job. Is if you try to please everybody, you're just setting yourself up to fail. So stop trying to do it. The second thing is that everything takes longer than you think. Like quite a lot longer, like really longer. There are also, so the most interesting thing for me is like, so 5 years ago I started, and within probably about 3-4 months I was like, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do da-da. And then here I am 5 years later. I mean, some of them are ticked off, but some of them are still on the list. But you've got to keep them on the list. Keep remembering what they are. Don't forget those things, but just stay. Any who's read Stephen Covey? Yeah. I'll say that a couple of times. Begin with the end in mind. Great piece of advice, but just And if you do that, and just recognise that everything will take longer, but if you'll get there in the end if you stay focused. In fact, and then the next one says, stay true to where you're trying to get to. And one of the biggest things that was sort of the turning point for me was, you spend time in taking other people with you. So I'd come from a sort of, highly sort of professional services, lots of graduates kind of environment, and suddenly went into a completely different culture. And when I was at KPMG, if you're a partner and you say, oh, this would be a good idea, somebody runs around and just does it. It's just like magic, they just do it. And then I was like, chief executives coming, I was like, oh, that should be a good idea. And then I waited, and like a month later, I was like, nobody's done it. And the reason why I learned was that I hadn't sort of invested the time to actually inspire and take people with you. So don't underestimate how long that takes, because everything takes longer than you think, if you remember the previous one. And then I've got a couple more, just to keep you on your toes at 5:30, is stop beating yourself up. I'm quite good at that one. And then the final one is follow your gut and your intuition. Again, it's back to those sort of like moments when you're faced with a really difficult decision. You're like, should I do this and should I do that? And you're trying to work out what all sort of pros and cons are and da-da-da. And actually, sometimes you just have a feeling about what the right thing is. And it's a little bit scary, but sometimes you just got to go with what you think is the right thing. Because if you don't, it's back to that, you'll sort of look back and go, I should have done that. And then you'll be beating yourself up. And remembering that everything takes longer than you think. So they're all sort of self-fulfilling. So it's very logical mind, that little scripture. Anyway, so there's my advice. Take it, leave it, completely up to you. And then so that's part 2. And then part 3 is at least shorter, so it's okay, you'll get your drink in a minute. The part 3, I guess, sort of connects the whole sort of retail transformation and thinking about sort of women and ways of working. Is just really to sort of touch on women in retail. So just to give you some stats, so out of those 3.1 million people, about 2/3 of the people who work in retail are female. And as I said earlier, the retail industry is the largest private sector employer across the country, with those 3.1 million people. And I guess you're all working in retail. I'm sure you all know that and believe that working in retail is a great job, and that actually it's a pretty, meritocracy, where anybody can kind of start at the bottom and make their way to the top, and you can see loads of people who've done just that. But I think the whole how we get more women into more senior positions is a real challenge for retail, because out of those 2/3 of people who work in the industry that are female, that proportion becomes smaller and smaller and smaller the further up the pyramid that you go, until you get to the sort of senior executive level, and it's probably less than 15, so it's more in the sort of 10 to 15% that are women. And one of the things that we've learned out of the research that we've done as part of the Better Jobs work that I mentioned earlier is to look at some of the barriers to progression around flexibility of roles. And it's really interesting that there's a number of businesses that are sort of looking at, I think flexibility at more senior levels is something that would potentially enable more people to progress to more senior roles, because people fear that they will lose that flexibility if they get promoted, and that is a barrier. But that is just one of the things that is the barrier to sort of addressing that balance across the pyramid. And I think that there's all sorts of levers that lots of businesses have to take, whether it's looking at flexibility, whether it's having sort of forums like this, whether it's having more role models, whether it's looking at sort of the ways of working. There's just kind of all sorts of levers that need to be pulled in a similar direction in order to make that change occur. So you are part of that change. You're all working in an industry that's in transformation, so join the two up and then make it great. And if you take my advice or leave it, and the end of what I wanted to say.